May 11th, 1987. A Lyon courtroom packed with journalists, survivors, and cameras from 23 countries. An old man sits in a glass booth, silver-haired, 73 years old, wearing thick glasses and a well-tailored suit. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, the man who sent Jewish children to Auschwitz, the torturer of French resistance fighters, the SS officer who turned Avenue Berthelot into a chamber of screams. You probably picture this trial as justice delayed, but finally delivered. The monster in the dock, the victims getting their day, the arc of history bending at last toward accountability. 43 years after the liberation of Lyon. 43 years after the crimes. But here's the strange part. By the time Klaus Barbie sat in that booth, he had lived 42 years as a free man, not in hiding, not cowering in some remote jungle compound, not under a false identity in fear of discovery. He had worked openly for the United States government. He had trained interrogators for military dictatorships across South America. He had trafficked arms across 3 continents. He had advised coups, run businesses, raised a family, attended cocktail parties in La Paz, and every Western intelligence agency that mattered had known exactly where he was, what he was doing, and who he had been. The CIA knew. The State Department knew. French intelligence knew. They had his address. They had photographs. They chose to do nothing. The real horror of Klaus Barbie isn't the crimes he committed between 1942 and 1945. It's that those crimes earned him a career. When the Nuremberg trials opened in November 1945, the Allied powers made a public promise broadcast to the world through newsreels and radio. Hunt the guilty. Bring them to justice. No exceptions. No amnesty. No safe harbour. And for the most visible Nazi leaders, the architects of the final solution, and the generals who waged aggressive war, that promise held. Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Julius Streicher, Wilhelm Keitel. They sat in the dock within 18 months of Germany's surrender. The proceedings were meticulous. Prosecutors presented thousands of documents. Survivors testified. Film footage from the camps was shown in open court. Executions followed. The International Military Tribunal convicted 24 defendants. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging. 10 were hanged on October 16, 1946. Göring killed himself with cyanide hours before his scheduled execution. The public message was clear and deliberate. The Nazi apparatus would be dismantled, its architects punished, its ideology repudiated in the most visible forum imaginable. But that promise had a shelf life measured in months, not years. By 1947, the Cold War was hardening into a permanent geopolitical architecture, and a different calculus was taking shape inside intelligence agencies and military command structures across the Western Alliance. The question was no longer who committed crimes, it was who might still be useful, who had contacts in the East, who spoke Russian, who understood communist cell structures, who could be turned, recruited, deployed. Compare Barbie's trajectory to the fates of other Gestapo officers and SS men of equivalent rank and equivalent crimes. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust's logistics, the man who coordinated train schedules and deportation quotas across occupied Europe, fled to Argentina in 1950 using a Red Cross travel document under the name Ricardo Clement. He lived in Buenos Aires, worked in a Mercedes-Benz factory, kept his head down. Israeli intelligence, Mossad, tracked him for years. They built a file. They verified his identity through handwriting analysis and surveillance photographs. On May 11th, 1960, exactly 27 years to the day before Barbie's trial would begin, Israeli agents grabbed Eichmann off a street in Buenos Aires, sedated him, and smuggled him onto a plane to Israel. He was tried in Jerusalem in 1961. The trial was televised. Survivors testified for months. He was convicted and hanged on May 31st, 1962. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in international waters beyond Israel's territorial limit, so that no grave would ever exist. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor who performed medical experiments on prisoners, who selected victims at the ramp with a flick of his finger, also fled to South America. Moved between Argentina, Paraguay and Brazil, constantly looking over his shoulder, changing names, moving safe houses, living in paranoia. Nazi hunters tracked him for decades. He drowned in Brazil in 1979 while swimming off a beach near Sao Paulo. He died under an assumed name. He never faced trial, but he never stopped running either. His remains were exhumed in 1985 and identified through forensic analysis. Eichmann was hunted, caught and executed. Mengele was hunted and lived in fear until death. Klaus Barbie was hired. Not pursued, hired. In April 1947, 2 years after the war ended, the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps recruited Klaus Barbie as an informant in occupied Germany. Not in secret, not quietly. His file was stamped with his real name, his SS rank, and his wartime post. Hauptsturmführer Klaus Barbie, former head of the Gestapo in Lyon. The CIC knew what he had done. Historian Christopher Simpson documented this in his 1988 book Blowback. The recruitment wasn't an accident or a clerical error. It was policy. Barbie had intelligence on communist networks in France and Germany. That made him valuable. The crimes made him available. He had nowhere else to go. Here's what Klaus Barbie did in Lyon between November 1942 and August 1944. He ran the Gestapo's Section 4, SIPO SD, the unit responsible for hunting Jews, resistance fighters, communists, anyone deemed an enemy of the Reich. His headquarters was at the Hotel Terminus near Lyon's Perrache railway station. Later, he moved operations to a building on Avenue Berthelot. The building had a cellar. The cellar had cells. The cells had drains in the floor. On April 6, 1944, Barbie personally led a raid on a children's home in the village of Izieu, 90 kilometers east of Lyon. The home sheltered Jewish refugee children whose parents had been deported or killed. 44 children were inside that morning, ages 4 to 17. Barbie arrived with trucks and armed men. The children were loaded into the vehicles, so were the 7 adults caring for them. All 44 children were deported to Auschwitz via the Drancy transit camp. 42 of them were gassed on arrival. 2 teenage boys survived long enough to be transferred to labour camps in Estonia, where they died in the final months of the war. None of the 44 survived. The home's director, Sabina Zlatin, was away in Montpellier that day attempting to secure additional funding. She returned to find the building empty. She survived to testify at Barbie's trial 43 years later. She described finding toys scattered on the floor and breakfast dishes still on the table. The Izieu raid wasn't operational necessity. There was no intelligence value. The children posed no threat. It was murder for the sake of fulfilling a quota. And then there's Jean Moulin. On June 21st, 1943, Barbie's men raided a resistance meeting in the Lyon suburb of Collioure. They arrested 8 men. One of them was Jean Moulin, General de Gaulle's delegate to the French resistance, the man tasked with unifying the fractured resistance networks into a coherent command structure. Moulin was brought to the Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Berthelot. Barbie interrogated him personally. For weeks, the methods were systematic. Beatings, electrical shocks applied to the body, water torture, suspension by the arms. Moulin refused to talk. Witnesses in adjacent cells reported hearing screams through the walls, screams that lasted for hours, sometimes days. One survivor, Christian Pinot, who was imprisoned in the same building, later testified that the guards called Barbie's interrogation room the screaming room. Moulin never broke. He died on July 8, 1943, en route to Germany, either from the injuries sustained during interrogation or from deliberate poisoning. His body was never recovered. French historian Henri Michel documented the interrogation in his 1964 study of the resistance. The transcripts of survivor testimony are archived at the Centre d'Histoire de la Résistance et de la Déportation in Lyon. Barbie's signature appears on Moulin's arrest file. These weren't isolated acts. Between 1942 and 1944, Barbie signed deportation orders for at least 763 people from Lyon and the surrounding Rhône-Alpes region. Most went to Auschwitz. Some went to Ravensbrück, the women's camp. A smaller number went to Nutzweiler-Struthof in Alsace. Historian Tom Bauer, in his 1984 biography, Klaus Barbie, cross-referenced Gestapo records with deportation manifests and survivor testimony. Of the 763 deported, fewer than 550 returned. Barbie also organised the deportation of the last convoy from Lyon to Auschwitz, which left on August 11, 1944, just 2 weeks before the city's liberation. The train carried 308 prisoners, most of them Jewish, some resistance members. The Allies were already in Normandy. Paris would be liberated in 2 weeks. Lyon itself would be free within days. The deportation had no strategic purpose. It was simply the final fulfillment of orders. 31 people survived that transport. The rest were murdered at Auschwitz within 72 hours of arrival. And here's where it gets stranger, where the institutional logic starts to crack open. The CIC didn't just use Barbie as an informant, a source they'd interview occasionally and then send on his way. They protected him from French justice as a matter of official policy. In 1948, French authorities issued an arrest warrant for Klaus Barbie on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The charges were specific: murder, torture, deportation. The French government requested his extradition from the American occupation zone in Germany. They provided documentation. They provided witness testimony. They provided his SS service record. The request went through official diplomatic channels. The CIC refused, not because they disputed the evidence, because they had other priorities. They moved Barbie between safe houses in Augsburg, Munich, and Memmingen. They gave him fake identity papers under the name Klaus Altmann, a name he would carry for the next 32 years. They kept him off official prisoner lists, off wanted lists, off any registry that the French could access. Alan Ryan Jr., who later led the US Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations and authored the 1984 report, Klaus Barbie and the United States government found internal CIC memos from 1949 and 1950 explicitly acknowledging the French extradition request. The memos, now declassified and archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, recommended ignoring the request. The phrase used repeatedly in the documents was operational necessity. Barbie's intelligence value, specifically his contacts within Communist Party networks in occupied Germany, and his knowledge of Soviet intelligence techniques, outweighed the crimes. One memo, dated March 12, 1950, written by CIC officer Eugene Kolb, stated plainly that Barbie's surrender to French authorities would compromise ongoing operations and intelligence sources. The memo was approved by Kolb's superior, CIC Region 12 Commander Earl Browning. Both men knew what Barbie had done. Both men chose to protect him anyway. Now compare that to the treatment of lower-ranking collaborators. In France, a Fête Liberation, the Opération Sauvage, the Wild Purge, saw roughly 9,000 executions of accused collaborators, most without trial. Women who had slept with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public squares. Vichy officials faced tribunals. Some were executed. Some were imprisoned. The French wanted accountability. They demanded it. But when they asked for Klaus Barbie, the Americans said no, not because they didn't know, because they did. That's the hinge. The whole story turns on it. The decision to protect Klaus Barbie wasn't made in a vacuum by rogue officers. It was made in the context of a broader, coordinated program. Operation Paperclip, approved by President Truman in 1945, brought 1,600 Nazi scientists to the United States. Wernher von Braun, who had overseen slave labor at the metalwork factory, where thousands died, became the architect of the American space program. Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence chief on the Eastern Front, surrendered to US forces with microfilm of his entire Soviet intelligence network. The Americans hired him to run what became West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, employing former SS and Gestapo agents. Historian Christopher Simpson documented this in his 1988 book Blowback. The recruitment wasn't opportunistic, it was systematic. Klaus Barbie fit the template perfectly. He had intelligence on communist networks. He had interrogation experience. His crimes made him desperate, which made him controllable. If you're watching this channel, you already know the darkest beats are still ahead. So if this kind of deep dive into the crimes history tried to bury speaks to you, hit subscribe, hit the bell. Because we're about to go deeper. In 1951, the French pressure was mounting. The CIC needed a permanent solution. They couldn't keep Barbie in Germany without risking a diplomatic crisis. So they arranged his escape to Bolivia through a smuggling network called the Rat Line, a Vatican-backed route that moved Nazi fugitives to South America. Barbie travelled as Klaus Altmann. The CIC provided documentation, funding, and contacts. He sailed from Genoa in March 1951 with his wife Regine and their 2 children. By April, they were in La Paz. Bolivia, in the 1950s, was ideal for Klaus Altmann. The government was unstable. Intelligence services were weak. Foreign expertise was welcome. Barbie started a business called Transmaritima Boliviana, importing industrial machinery. He joined the German Bolivian Chamber of Commerce. He sent his children to the German school. He was, by all appearances, a respectable businessman. And he kept his head down. But in 1964, a military coup brought General René Barrientos to power, and Barbie found his niche. He became a consultant to the Ministry of the Interior and the Intelligence Service. He trained interrogators. He advised on counterinsurgency tactics. The methods were the same: isolation, sleep deprivation, electric shocks, beatings. The Lyon playbook exported. In 1967, Barbie was involved in the hunt for Che Guevara. When Guevara was captured on October 8, 1967, Barbie was part of the operational chain. Bolivian military records show he trained several officers involved in Guevara's capture and interrogation. In 1971, Barbie helped coordinate intelligence during Hugo Banzer's coup. Banzer's regime, which ruled from 1971 to 1978, was one of Latin America's most repressive. Thousands were arrested. Hundreds disappeared. Torture was systematic. Barbie trained the interrogators. He provided technical advice. He built the systems. And he was paid for it by the Bolivian state, the same state receiving US military aid throughout the 1970s. The American embassy knew who Klaus Altmann was. CIA station chiefs knew. Declassified State Department cables reference Altmann and note his background. No action was taken. Now put the whole thing together. From 1947 to 1983, Klaus Barbie lived in the open as Klaus Altmann. He ran businesses, attended social events, raised a family. French authorities knew his alias by 1971, when Beate Klarsfeld, a Nazi hunter, traced him to La Paz. She confronted him on the street on February 11, 1972, asking in German, "Are you Klaus Barbie?" He replied, "I am Klaus Altmann. I have been Klaus Altmann for 20 years. He didn't run, he didn't deny his past. Klarsfeld published his address in European newspapers. She held press conferences. She demanded extradition. France submitted a formal request. Bolivia refused, claiming the statute of limitations had expired. The real reason was that Barbie was still useful. The United States stayed silent. 12 more years, from 1972 to 1983, Klaus Barbie remained free in La Paz, his identity known, his location published, his crimes documented. What changed in 1983 was not morality, it was politics. Bolivia's military government collapsed in 1982, and a civilian administration under President Hernán Siles Zuazo took power. France renewed its extradition request. Bolivia agreed. On February 5, 1983, Bolivian police arrested Klaus Altmann. His fingerprints matched Klaus Barbie's Gestapo file. He was placed on a plane to France and landed at Lyon on February 7th. The trial wouldn't begin for another 4 years, but the arc was finally closing, or so it seemed. And here's the final twist, the detail that breaks the caricature wide open. During his 1987 trial, Barbie's defense attorney Jacques Vergès attempted a two-quote defense, arguing that France had no moral authority to try Barbie because France had committed comparable atrocities in Algeria and Indochina. He wasn't defending Barbie's innocence. He was attacking the court's legitimacy. Vergès called witnesses who testified about French torture in Algeria from 1954 to 1962. He submitted documents showing French forces had used electric shocks, water torture, beatings identical to Barbie's methods. He referenced the Battle of Algiers, where French paratroopers systematically tortured prisoners. He cited Paul Orchestrated, a French intelligence officer who later admitted to personally torturing and executing dozens of Algerians. The court rejected the argument. Presiding Judge André Sedini ruled that Barbie's crimes were crimes against humanity under Nuremberg definitions. Colonial abuses were a separate matter, but Vergès had exposed a nerve. For 8 weeks, French television showed testimony about Izieu and Jean Moulin, but also about Algerian civilians tortured by French soldiers, about the Phoenix program in Vietnam, about Operation Condor in South America. Klaus Barbie, sitting in his glass booth, said nothing. His defense attorney was making the case that Barbie wasn't an aberration. He was part of a system that had simply changed flags. The trial lasted from May 11th to July 4th, 1987. 557 days of testimony from survivors, historians, archivists, and former resistance members. More than 100 witnesses testified. Sabina's Latin described returning to the empty children's home at Izieu. Former prisoners described the screaming room on Avenue Berthelot. Deportation records were read aloud in court. Photographs from Auschwitz were entered into evidence. Klaus Barbie sat in his glass booth and said almost nothing. His lawyers spoke for him. He was convicted on all counts. 240 counts of crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to life in prison. Under French law, life meant life, no parole, no reduction. He would die in prison. He showed no remorse during the sentencing. In his final statement to the court, delivered through his attorney, he described his wartime work as duty to his country. He described his post-war work as survival in a world that had turned him into a hunted man. He never apologized. He never acknowledged the pain of his victims. He died in prison on September 25, 1991, at the age of 77, from leukemia. He served 4 years of his life sentence. He had lived 46 years as a free man, a fighter, leaving Lyon. Now compress it. Let every beat land. Klaus Barbie tortured children and sent them to gas chambers. He murdered resistance leaders with his own hands. He signed deportation orders for hundreds of men, women and children who were gassed at Auschwitz within days of arrival. And when the war ended, when the tribunals began, when the architects of genocide were being hanged at Nuremberg, he was hired, not hunted, not prosecuted, hired. He was recruited by the United States Counterintelligence Corps in 1947 with full knowledge of his crimes. He was protected from French extradition requests as a matter of written policy. He was smuggled to Bolivia in 1951 on an American-funded escape route. He worked for the Bolivian intelligence service. He trained interrogators who tortured political prisoners. He advised military coups. He lived openly under an alias for 32 years, while Western intelligence agencies knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. French survivors begged for justice. French prosecutors issued warrants, and the governments that claimed to stand for human rights, for the rule of law, for the lessons of Nuremberg, protected him, funded him, employed him, and looked away. For 46 years, that's not the story of one man's crimes. It's the story of institutions that chose complicity. So here's the question. When we talk about the crimes of Klaus Barbie, Are we talking about the atrocities he committed in a basement in Lyon? Or are we talking about the decision, made in Washington and ratified in silence by Paris and London, that those atrocities didn't matter as long as he was useful? Because one of those crimes ended in 1945, the other continued until 1983, and only one required the complicity of democracies. If this kind of history matters to you, you know what to do. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you never miss an upload. And if you want more stories about the moral compromises buried in the Cold War, go watch our video on Operation Condor next. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.